It was always understood that Meghan Markle's multi-million-dollar deal to produce content for the streaming juggernaut Netflix came accompanied by certain caveats, chiefly, an expectation that those on the payroll uphold a veneer of discretion and loyalty to the company's marquee personalities. But when one veteran executive secretly absconded from the ranks and began unspooling a torrent of scathing indictments about the Duchess of Sussex's workplace persona, any adherences to traditional decorum were promptly incinerated. "She's just so palpably inauthentic and robotic, it's genuinely unsettling interacting with her in person," the former high-level creative strategist divulged mere hours after tendering an abrupt resignation motivated in part by a terminal erosion of faith in Meghan's fundamental credibility and value as a content creator. The affectations, mannerisms, that grating tonal monotone where every utterance seems disingenuously focus-grouped within an inch of its life, it all congeals into this deeply synthetic, intentionally sculpted impression that everything emanating from her is essentially artificial. What unfolded from there represented an unfettered evisceration of nearly every aspect of Meghan's professional identity, from her reputed talents as a skilled orator and storyteller capable of uplifting diverse, underrepresented voices, to even the most granular dissections of her physical presence and stylistic signatures that had become cultural obsessions. Over the span of several broadsides, the departed Netflix lieutenant viscerally dismantled the curated facades that had allowed the Duchess to sizably monetize her notoriety into one of the industry's most lucrative personal brands. Meghan simply has no range beyond this painfully self-conscious, profound voice of modern womanhood regimen she seems to robotically cycle through ad nauseum, the defector continued while firmly etching lines in the proverbial career sand that would scuttle any thought of future media rehabilitation. She's essentially reduced herself down to this one-dimensional composite of viral identity-detached activism sloganeering without any of the actualized depth or narrative acuity needed to galvanize those messages into lasting, substantive art or cultural impact. The grenades of unrestrained acrimony only proliferated from there, with the runaway informant asserting that the deified Duchess was ultimately little more than an ungainly chimera of dubiously authentic advocacies and emaciated narcissistic tendencies. According to excerpts, Meghan routinely demonstrated a zealous passion for inhabiting various underserved or marginalized identities when given the appropriate spotlight, only to rapidly revert to extraordinarily privileged and vapid self-absorption once the cameras turned off. This duality, the source insisted, had begun fostering a creeping suspicion among Netflix's creative ranks about the Duchess's seemingly calculated habit of shamelessly appropriating the aesthetics of the oppressed while leaving the actual bondages of systemic injustice utterly unconfronted. Like it's genuinely astounding, here you have this fabulously wealthy biracial woman of aristocratic pedigree who has essentially struck culture-wide celebrity for the perceived gravities of simply existing as, well, herself. The aberrant stream of insider observations continued with dizzying momentum. And yet, when you start probing at her core belief systems or demanding artistic substance beyond saccharine platitudes and inspirationally branded lifestyle dreck, the veneer just completely cracks into this sort of emaciated, eerily blank characterology. As the deluge of unsanctioned disclosures gathered in torrential intensity, the animating forces behind such an acrimonious severance began to take form. According to the estranged collaborator, much of the animosity stemmed from deep frustrations about the Duchess's perceived cultural tokenism and tendencies of chasing superficial representation over substantive commentary on the inequities undergirding her advocacies. Particularly incendiary allegations spoke of Markle actively resisting character development for an upcoming scripted series that would have veered away from identity-detached melodramas of socio-economic misery aesthetics and into more probing psychological excavations of systemic and cultural trauma. On multiple occasions, notes and directives purportedly surfaced from the Duchess's quarters demanding an elevated emphasis on resilience iconography, while all but dismissing proposals to depict the brutal realities of systemic demonization across racial and socio-economic stratifications. There's just this instinctual aversion to inhabiting anything beyond carefully constructed, inspirationally branded identities of marginalization and advocacy that has left many of us deeply unsettled about her creative instincts beyond just cynically fading an aesthetic of struggle for pure visual wallpaper, the source lamented in what appeared to be rhetorical sorties approaching outright cancellation territory. Imagine cultivating a global activism brand ostensibly meant to highlight the oppressed and disempowered only to run completely arid and confronted with the uglier, more lacerating realities that accompany narratives of the marginalized and systemically demonized. It's all just part and parcel of what's made Meghan such an inscrutable, deeply unnerving producer to collaborate with behind the scenes. There's this instinctual compulsion to recoil from anything that might threaten her tidy, ultra-privileged conception of adversity and struggle as commodified identity totems. But beyond artistically vacuous limitations that threaten to render Meghan's entire production principle substantively inert from a storytelling standpoint, it was allegedly the Duchess's workplace demeanor itself that sowed deepening reservoirs of alienation and distrust. Long gone were the halcyon intervals when the prospect of adding a glamorously self-styled voice for the voiceless to Netflix's prestigious originals slate had ostensibly promised unrivaled mainstream resonance and critical credentialing. Instead, the recent experiences spoke of grating, ego-forward pathologies curdling working relationships across all cadres of the company. Just this perpetual, low-key ambient hostility radiating outward from her across every preliminary meeting and creative session, like being gaslit into feeling perpetually lesser for not properly validating her self-superiority complexes, lamented a producer whose initial interactions with Markle devolved into lasting professional antagonisms over irreconcilable creative differences. Whether it was the incessant need to promote herself as some profound, unassailable moral truth-teller, or the undercurrent of sneering dismissals for any who questioned the substantive value of her contributions, Meghan just naturally generated these self-superior affectations of a privileged sociopath irrespective of room or collaborator. Similar refrains rippled amongst the disgruntled contingent once the levees finally burst against their notorious benefactress. In harrowing detail, the émigrés described how Meghan's compulsions to monopolize and dominate workplace discourse created escalating internecine tensions that steadily curried disaffection from even her most ardent supporters. Whether it manifested as full-throated hostility and retaliations against perceived questioning of her talents and standing, or simply the steadfast refusal to yield prominent platforms and spotlight prioritization to more seasoned collaborators, the Duchess's reputed talents for petulance and exclusionary tactics calcified into an existential irritant. Many former colleagues even described how Meghan's very vocal tonalities and speech patterns came increasingly suffused with grating grandiloquence that provoked resentments in colleagues seeking honest connection rather than meticulously curated wokesplaining. We'd be in these pre-production meetings supposedly workshopping how to translate marginalized experiences into pathos-laden character portraits, and Meghan would just drone on in these lugubrious cadences about amplifying the subaltern communities and centering resilience narratives until anyone not bludgeoned into a sycophantic reverie by the end pretty much lost the will to collaborate, disclosed one producer. Like hour after numbing hour of being subjected to this lavishly overwritten affectation of sermonizing from atop an invisible soapbox about the importance of her mission-driven artistry when the true impetus all along was serving nothing more than her own gratifying ego reinforcement and perverse moral virtuo signaling. Beyond the overarching critiques of professional disaffection and creative aridity, perhaps most dismantling were the meticulous anatomies provided of Meghan's physical aesthetics and behavioral rigidity that came under relentless scrutiny. What began with scathing insights about her purportedly hyper-stylized